Jasper was born almost, but not quite royal. His parents were Catherine de Valois, who was the widowed queen of Henry V, and her second husband, Owen Tudor. And there was a good deal of scandal attaching to that marriage, as Owen was not only a member of the Queen's household, but also a Welshman, and subject to very severe legal restrictions in England. So there was a lot of secrecy surrounding Jasper's birth. But fortunately for Jasper, his half-brother, Queen Catherine's son, was king, obviously, Henry VI, but he was also a very kind and generous man, and he supported his mother's second family. And Jasper and his brother Edmund received large estates, earldoms, and a wealthy heiress as a ward. And Jasper repaid this generosity by his lifelong loyalty to Henry VI, Henry's wife and son, and later to the son of the woman Henry had bestowed on his brother as a bride, the king's cousin Margaret Beaufort. So I think what we can say about Jasper is he knew how to repay generosity, and he was a loyal and committed friend to his family.
And he fought throughout the Wars of the Roses. He was present at the beginning and at the end, right? So was he considered to be kind of a good military leader, or was he just really... He had great wits about him as well, didn't he?
He certainly had great wits about him. I think it's perhaps a moot point about his actual military skill in open battles. Now, it is assumed he was actually at both the First Battle of St Albans and at Bosworth itself, but there's no absolutely definite proof he was at either battle. It just seems the most likely place for him to have been, obviously, particularly at Bosworth. You'd have expected him to be there. The battles he fought in, other than Bosworth, were not actually particularly successful. The First Battle of St Albans, the Lancastrians lost. Then the only battle where we know Jasper actually commanded was Mortimer's Cross in 1461, where he was very heavily defeated. He didn't make it to Tewkesbury, and Bosworth, of course, was a great victory, but it was mainly down to the Earl of Oxford, who was the overall commander. Where Jasper's military skill seems to have been was in siege warfare and guerrilla warfare. He conducted a very successful campaign to capture Denbigh Castle from the Yorkists, the only person to actually ever capture that castle by a siege. And he spent most of the 1460s conducting guerrilla warfare. He would come into Harlech Castle from France or Brittany or various other places where he was looking for support, and do a bit of raiding and generally have a damaging effect on Yorkist castles in Wales, and then he'd disappear again. So more of a guerrilla warrior than an open battle kind of a chap.
So why should we know about him?
Jasper's claim to fame really is that if it were not for him, it's highly unlikely that Henry Tudor would ever have even got to the field at Bosworth, let alone won the battle. After the Lancastrians had been defeated at Tewkesbury and Jasper's older nephew, Edward of Lancaster, had been killed, the young Henry Tudor became the only possible heir to the Lancastrian claim to the throne. So Jasper supported him. He took him into exile. Henry was only 14, and presumably through those years supported him morally, if not, even if he couldn't support him financially or in any other way. And then when the time came for Henry to invade, it was into Jasper's old lands of the earldom of Pembroke that they sailed directly there. And Jasper's relationships with the local nobility and gentry had lasted long enough, even through exile, for Henry to actually get a toehold into Wales, and enabled him to raise enough of an army to invade and win at Bosworth. If Jasper hadn't had friends in Wales, it's very likely that Henry would have just been captured and come to a sticky end.
But early on, didn't he seem, when it was all just beginning, didn't he seem kind of willing to work with Warwick and with the Yorkists? I guess that was down to just, at the time, it wasn't as if they were trying to position themselves as actually taking the throne. But it seemed as if he wanted to be on good working terms with Warwick. And then even later when Warwick came to France, he seemed willing to try and broker deals. A, is that true? And B, what do you think made him change his mind and kind of stay so loyal to Lancaster throughout his life?
I think you're right that he was perhaps of a conciliating nature, and certainly his nephew Henry VII was, and Henry VI was as well. So all three Henrys seemed inclined to working with people rather than instantly going for battles. It was definitely apparent to everyone in the 1450s, even to Jasper and his brother Edmund, that despite his best intentions, Henry VI was an absolutely hopeless king. And his queen, Marguerite of Anjou, she was not a good queen in the sense that she was very, very divisive. So most of the nobles of the 1440s and 50s, they wanted Henry's government to continue, but to improve. And if that could be done by giving York authority, they were willing to support that. And I think that's where Jasper was in his relations with York. He wanted to see better government and less of the very factional state of affairs that was leading to the government being broke, more or less, and increasing unrest. I think the problems then arose when it became clear that there was no way of compromising, really, because a number of York supporters were equally factional, same as Queen Marguerite, and they wanted to take perhaps more power than was their fair share. But there was also long-standing rivalries between York and Somerset, Warwick, Salisbury and Northumberland were at daggers drawn. Eventually, it became apparent that there was no middle way, and Jasper, when he was forced to choose, he supported his brother, his half-brother, and he never deviated from that, not once.
And that loyalty, of course, made him a fugitive more than once, and he spent a lot of time in exile in various forms, the long exile and short periods. How do you think all of that affected him?
I think that's a really interesting psychological question. I think he's a very interesting character psychologically. I think one of the things that Exile did was make him very self-reliant, because there were times when he had to escape very swiftly, possibly in disguise, or sounds very romantic, disguised as a peasant. He'd have had to be able to just walk away from anything that held him back. Insofar as everyday life is concerned, it probably prevented him marrying. He hadn't married in the late 1450s when he might have been expected to, possibly because there weren't suitable candidates. Perhaps Henry VI, not being a particularly vigorous king, hadn't arranged anything. So once he was in exile, it pretty much became impossible to marry a woman of his own rank. Nobody was going to marry their daughter to a man who was penniless and roaming around the courts of Europe, trying to raise money and troops. So that probably affected him. He probably, I think he was somebody who had a very focused character. I can imagine that in a previous age he might have been a crusader. I think he liked having a cause and was one of those people who would follow that cause wherever it led him.